This last week, I took CTA down to Moody Bible Institute. There's a program going on at Moody last week called Founders Week. And it's a series of messages and seminars and a whole just heap of stuff where they bring in great speakers, and it's all free. You can just head on down there and just attend these services, and it's really great. Well, one of the days, I believe it was Thursday. Was it Thursday? I've lost track of my week. It was Wednesday. On Wednesday, they had this special thing down there for a lunch for pastors. And they had Chicago-style pizza and all that stuff. And I'm like, I'm there. Free lunch, I'm there. So I went down there, but my wife needed the car, and so I had to take CTA. I rode the Peterson bus over to the Bryn Mawr station, and then I hopped on the red line, and I went down the red line to Chicago Street, or Avenue, whatever it is. And I got out, and as soon as I climbed up the subway stairs, I realized I know where Moody is, but I don't know where I am in relation to it. I could drive there on my own, but this was a new thing for me. I was standing there on the corner of Chicago and State Street, just wondering to myself, where is LaSalle? And I looked to my left, and I saw a sign for Dearborn. And I looked to my right, and way down there I saw another the green sign, but I couldn't tell what the word on it was. And so I thought to myself, okay. And I figured out that this way was north, and that way was east, so the lake must be over there. And this way over here was west, and I thought, I have no idea what I'm doing anyway, so it doesn't matter. So I just went, and I turned this way, and I started heading this way. And those of you who know Chicago know that was stupid. But I was going in this direction, and I didn't realize what I was doing until I walked about 6 blocks and ended up on Michigan Avenue. And I thought, I know Michigan Avenue. Now, for those of you who have picked up on this, I'm not originally from Chicago. I don't spend a whole lot of time in downtown Chicago, and so thus my ineptitude. But I knew Michigan Avenue because, everybody knows Michigan Avenue. If you've ever seen National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation or any kind of show that involves Chicago, you know about Michigan Avenue. So I knew I was in the wrong spot. Turned around. Actually, I should tell you, I did go into an establishment and ask someone there which way LaSalle was. And then I went back. So I walked back to LaSalle and finally made it to Moody and got to the session on time because I was so early coming off the red line. I had planned that far in advance, knowing that I was stupid. And so I made it there on time, and it was all fine. But I bring that up just to say that all of us face times in our lives when we reach a turning point. When we reach a decision that we have to make of, am I going to go this way or am I going to go this way? What difference does it make? Well, the difference of a tiny little decision here in this place makes huge differences as it's lived out over a life. And so the decisions you make at every individual turning point combine into being who you are down the road. Today we're going to be looking at a series of passages here in Mark that really describe turning points. And so the message today, as we're beginning to reflect on what it means to recommit our lives to Jesus, I want to just draw your attention to some key turning points in this week's series of passages that you'll be reading. The first one is in Mark chapter 8, verses 22 through 26. I'm going to go ahead and read this. Just follow along with me if you have a Bible. It's not going to be up on the screen, but if you have one of the little blue Bibles from the pews in front of you, you can find a table of contents in the beginning. Find your way to Mark chapter 8, verse 22. We've got plenty of time here in Mark chapter 8, so if you don't get it by the time I'm done reading, keep looking and it'll serve you well later. Anyway, here it is. Mark 8:22. They came to Bethsaida, they meaning Jesus and his disciples. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't go into the village." This is the turning point for a blind man. What you find is that this story is incredibly unique in all of the stories about Jesus for one particular reason. And that reason is that Jesus does this miracle in a two-phase approach. He does this miracle in two different stages. He doesn't just snap his fingers and lo and behold, this person is all better. He does it in two stages. Now, this is unlike any other miracles that we've seen so far as we've been going through the Gospel of Mark. Or if you know anything about Jesus, it makes this miracle unique. He does this one in two stages. And so what I think we just have to realize is that this blind man is actually faced with a turning point. He's faced with a turning point, but before we get to his turning point, I want to just share with you something about Jesus. Jesus does this miracle in a special way, I believe, for a couple reasons. One reason is for the sake of this man. I think he had to show this man something. We'll get to that in a little bit. But I think another thing that Jesus wanted to do is he wanted to show us something. Particularly, what he wanted to show us is this, and you can write it down. This will be your first blank if you're filling in the blanks. Jesus doesn't ever leave his work half done. He never leaves his work half done. You see, I believe Jesus intentionally did stage one in a partial manner so that he could do stage two to prove to us he's not going to leave his work half done. But even more than that, even beyond that, I think what we have to realize is what Jesus was doing for the blind man. See, the blind man was faced with an experience and a turning point. If you were blind your entire life, what would you feel like the first time you saw light or anything? Wouldn't that be just cool? Wouldn't that be exciting? If you were blind your entire life, your eyes had never experienced anything except just total black, and then all of a sudden you see something, even just a spark of light, that would be so exciting, that would be so joyous, you would just be, yes, this is awesome, this is great. Because he was blind, he didn't know any better. But see, Jesus said to the man, what do you see? And the man said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. He's felt trees before. You know, he knows what a tree feels like. And now it's like he sees these things that are like sticks that he's imagined trees were, and they're moving around. He says, I see people. They're like trees walking around. I imagine he was pretty excited. Jesus says, no, that's not good enough. Hold on. I got some more to do. So he goes through this process again, and then he says, now, what do you see? And the guy sees clearly. You see, I believe that the blind man was faced with a turning point decision here. Not a decision so much as just a turning point experience. And what he needed to do is he needed to move beyond what I call good enough thinking. He needed to move beyond good enough thinking. A lot of us have that same kind of problem. And you can see this in the blind man or the people surrounding Jesus with the blind man. You know, if I were there, I would have been like, dude, you see trees? You see people and they look like trees? That's awesome. Now let's go to the local optometrist or lens crafters and get you some glasses. That'll clear that thing all up and you'll be great. You'll be cool. You know, because as long as it's blurry, we can take it from here, Jesus. But no, Jesus says, wait a minute. I don't want you to ever be in a good enough thinking mindset. It's never good enough unless Jesus brings it all the way to completion. It's never good enough unless Jesus makes it exactly the way it's supposed to be. He says to the man, basically, don't settle for halfway. I'm going to take it all the way to the end. Now, the reason this story is important to us today is because I imagine some of us in this room right now are sort of in the blind man's position. We're faced with that same kind of turning point. You know, maybe there's something going on in your life where you feel like Jesus started something, but he hasn't finished it. Maybe he began something and you got all excited about it beginning, but it's not done yet. Maybe there's that little bit of doubt in you. And you're saying to yourself, man, is this good enough? Is this what it was supposed to be? But you know what? Jesus never leaves a job half done. If he started something in your life, he's going to bring it to completion. He's going to take it to the place where it's supposed to be. And when you get there, you're going to say, wow, I can see clearly now. So don't give up. And don't say, you know, I feel like this is all I'm going to get. Maybe you're in a position where Jesus has done something and you have to trust him to complete it. Or maybe you're in a position where most of your life you've been satisfied with just good enough. something's going on in your life, and it's just good enough. You're just making do. You can't see clearly, but if you wear the right glasses at the right time in the right situations, then things are cool. It's good enough. And Jesus says, no, I want you to move beyond good enough thinking, and to move all the way to divine thinking. What can God do in this situation? Not what is it now, not what is good enough, but what can God do? Dream big and always pursue another step, growing. Look at this next story, though, because that's the first turning point. The second turning point you find is Jesus' own turning point. I'll read it for you in Mark 8:27 through 30. This is what it says. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. You see, Jesus reached a turning point here. And I know some of you are thinking, wait a minute, Jesus reached a turning point? He was God in the flesh. How could he ever reach a turning point? Well, we oftentimes forget that Jesus was also a fully human being. And he reached a turning point here that I think is essential for us to realize today. His turning point was simply this. His disciples had come to a place of realizing his identity. That's the first thing. First of all, the disciples now knew Jesus' identity. But that meant that Jesus now had to teach them about his mission. You see, up until this point, Jesus had been doing miracles, he'd been healing people, he'd been feeding people, he'd been teaching people about God, he'd been working with his disciples, he'd been interacting with them on what is this stuff all about, really, and he'd been spending all this sort of infrastructure, foundation-laying kind of work. But whenever anyone said anything like, "Oh, Son of God," like the demons that would proclaim to Jesus, "You're the Son of God, don't treat us poorly," Jesus would silence them. In almost every case, he would silence them. And so he kept trying to say, no, we're not going to deal with the question of my identity yet. That's for later. But now he's come to a point in time where his disciples know it. And there's no going back. There's no turning back. The disciples say, "You are the Christ." Now, the Christ is a Greek word that was a translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, that was the descriptive word for someone that was promised thousands and thousands of years before Jesus. About 2,000 years before Jesus, God started the process with different people, and over the years told them little bits and little bits more of this person who was going to come eventually. And as we got to the prophets who were around maybe 400 or 500 years before Jesus, they began to elaborate on this more as God was giving them more wisdom. And they all began to point to one significant individual they called the Anointed One or the Chosen One. That's what the word Christ means. That's what the word Messiah means. It means the special one, the chosen one, the anointed one. And so Peter looks at Jesus and he says, "Jesus, you're the one we've been waiting for all these years. You're the one. You're the Christ. You're the Messiah." And Jesus says, "Now hold on a second. Before you go too far, it's now time for me to tell you what it means." And Jesus says, it means I'm going to be killed. It means I'm going to die. Jesus reached a turning point because, you know what? Once his disciples knew his identity, the question of who am I is in the past. Now the question becomes, why am I here? And he knows why he's there. He knows he's on a path to the cross. And he knows now I'm going. It's a major turning point. There's no going back. This is the turning point moment for Jesus, moving beyond the who am I to the why am I here. Some of you, I think, are sort of in that place. And you're struggling with the who am I question. And maybe it's time for you to just say, you know what? I am who I am because God made me. I am who I am because I know Jesus. And it's time for you to move beyond that into the why am I here? What am I supposed to do? You see, one of the biggest problems that we have as human beings is we get so wrapped up in ourselves. We get so wrapped up in ourselves that we forget a major reason we're here. In fact, the only reason we're here is other people. You didn't choose to be born. Well, maybe you did, but that would be a weird story, and I don't really need to hear it. You didn't choose to be born. The truth of the matter is someone else chose to give birth to you. That's why we celebrate Mother's Day and to a lesser extent Father's Day. Because someone else chose to give you birth. You did not determine when you would enter this world. And so the question of focusing on yourself, who am I, all the time, can sometimes take you into a pity party or a prideful selfish kind of attitude towards life around you that just is taking you in the wrong direction. You didn't choose to be here. Someone else chose for you to be here. Ultimately, it was God. And the question you have to ask is, why? If I'm here because of someone else, maybe I'm here for someone else. If God chose to put you here, maybe you're here for Him. And maybe it's about time that you make a decision that says, you know what, I'm going to stop focusing on myself and I'm going to start focusing on others. That's what Jesus was at. Do you realize that? At this moment in time, Jesus had to consciously say, I am going to walk all the way to the cross. And it's the first time Jesus told His disciples that was His plan. He said, I am going to die. And once those words come out of His mouth, He can't say, well, I changed my mind later. No, He's on the path. He made a decision, a commitment right then to live for the sake of other people. As if He hadn't already done it, but He had, in fact. Let's look at the next turning point. The next turning point is Peter. And it's the exact same passage that we just read for Jesus, except a couple extra verses added on. Jesus begins to teach them that He's going to be killed. And let's look at verse 32. He spoke plainly about this. Up until this point, Jesus had been telling stories and metaphors and kind of speaking around things and not really explaining things absolutely clearly. But right here at this point, He says, no, this has to be totally clear. This has to be totally clear. We're not in the trees walking around phase. We are in the total clarity phase, and let me get it for you. It's right here. He says, I am going to die. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took Him aside and began to rebuke Him. Well, I love Peter. The reason I love Peter is he's such an idiot that, compared to him, sometimes I actually look good. I mean, think about this. What did Peter just say to him? He said, you're the Christ, right? Which means you're the chosen one of God, right? Which means you're the one that God picked, right? Which means you don't stand up to Him and say, now, wait a minute, I think you're wrong. That's silly. That's stupid. He says, wait a minute, Jesus, you're wrong on this. I got to just... And what I also love is that Peter, Peter kind of takes Jesus aside. Jesus, come with me. I got to tell you something. You're wrong about that whole thing. You got to stop playing games like that. Like Peter's his mentor. Luckily, Peter doesn't stay so stupid. He later turns pretty bright once the Holy Spirit grabs a hold of him. But right here, he rebukes Jesus. But when Jesus turned and looked at His disciples, now Jesus is bringing the disciples into it, and He rebukes Peter. He says, get behind me, Satan. Strong words for Peter. Get behind me, Satan, He said. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. You see, the truth of the matter is that Jesus realized Peter was facing a turning point. Peter was facing a turning point in this situation because he had realized something was true about Jesus, but he had no idea what it meant. Here are the 3 blanks here to jot down. Peter had identified Jesus. Peter rebuked Jesus, and then Jesus rebuked Peter. But what is the turning point for Peter? He had to move beyond an idea to a person. You see, Peter had an idea in his head of what it meant to be the Messiah, the Christ, the chosen one. He had his idea in his head, and when Jesus said something that didn't match the idea, Peter said, no, you're wrong about that, Jesus. But the fact is that Peter was wrong. And Peter had to move beyond the idea to the person to say, Jesus, it's not about my idea, it's about you. Following me? Now, I think some of us are also in that kind of mode because if you've been in church for a long time, you've got a lot of ideas about God. You've got a lot of ideas about church. You've got a lot of ideas about your own life. You've got a lot of ideas about the Bible. And sometimes those ideas can get in the way. God might want to do something in your life, and you'll say, no, wait a minute, God, that's not the way you work. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you haven't. I've been there. I know what that's all about. And you say, God, that's not the way you work. I don't believe you work that way. And so then you reject the work of God in your midst, in your life. But you know what? It's not about an idea or a concept. It's about a person, a relationship. That's the turning point Peter had to make, and that's the turning point you and I have to make. One more. What Jesus does next is he includes the whole crowd. He brings a bunch of people together and he begins to teach them. And in this crowd, you and I get our turning point. Let's follow along with what Jesus says here, Mark 8:34 through 9:1. Then he called the crowd along with his disciples and said, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." And he said to them, "I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God come with power." The thing that Jesus says in the middle here is the biggest, most profound statement, one of the biggest, most profound statements that you find Jesus saying. And he addresses it to the whole crowd, which means you and me too. He says, whoever wants to follow me, whoever wants to come after me must take up his cross, deny himself, and follow me. He says, whoever looks to save his life is going to lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. You see, it's these opposites that Jesus brings up, and we say, what is this all about? In plain and simple fact, here's the truth. Jesus came into this world to die. And he calls each one of his followers to die. And it doesn't necessarily mean physical death right now. Jesus isn't saying, you know what you got to do? You got to die right now in order to be my follower. That doesn't make a lot of sense. What he does say is if your focus and your perspective is on holding on to the stuff of your life, you're just going to lose it. But if your focus and your perspective is on giving everything up to what God has for you, you're going to find a life you've never known. Let me ask you this question. What is your life? Ever heard the phrase, man, my family is my life. My job is my life. My house is my life. Let me ask you, what is your life? What are those things in your life that you associate with your life? Is it your family? Is it your friendships? For some people, it's even their church. You know, they'll say, you know what? My church is my life. Jesus says, whatever you hold on to, you're going to lose. But whatever you give up, you're going to gain. That's a paradoxical kind of statement, but let me just bring it down to bottom line reality for all of us. The bottom line reality is that we are facing a turning point. And he is calling you to make a decision. And that's a decision to move beyond self-preservation to a place of sacrifice. Move beyond self-preservation to a place of sacrifice. Too many of us are so constantly focused on preserving my experience, my life. And Jesus says, no. Move beyond that to a place of sacrifice. I'll give you a couple examples of what that might mean. If you're a family and you're really worried about your children, one way to apply this principle is to say, you know, I cannot control every aspect of my child's life. What I need to do is I need to hand it over to God. And I need to pray for my child. I need to teach my child the best I can. But I need to hand it over to God ultimately and say, whatever God has in store for this child, so long as this child is willing, that's going to be cool. Now, that's hard to do. It's hard to hand over something that's precious to you to God, because ultimately, when push comes to shove, a lot of us don't actually trust God. But he says, you know, hand it over. Another thing that might attack people, maybe even in this church, is sort of the concept that my opinions or my desires I have to hold on to and preserve and protect. And that if there are other people in this world, in my life, who, are attacking me on something, then I have to protect these ideas, these opinions, these things, these desires. Maybe Jesus is saying to you, hand some of that stuff over. The truth of the matter is, we are facing a turning point. Today, in this place, we're all facing a turning point. And what we have to do is we have to choose to respond to today's turning point in a way that draws us closer to Jesus. And so I want to ask you right now to pull out that little recommitment form that you've got there. And I just want to show you 4 key commitments that describe what we've just talked about today. The first commitment on that form says, I commit myself to the person of Jesus Christ. What that is that's just simply reaching the Peter turning point. And it says, you know what? I'm going to put more attention into Jesus himself than into my idea of Jesus. It's a commitment to Jesus, a commitment to say, I'm going to follow him and I'm going to focus on him with my whole life. The second one is a commitment to the people of Jesus. It's a commitment that says, you know what? I am going to simply make myself aware of the fact that I need to give up on my me-ness and focus on some otherness. Maybe this is the associated with the self-preservation and the sacrifice thing. Because ultimately what we need to do is we need to say, if other people are important to me, then I need to sacrifice myself a little bit for them. The second commitment there is to make a commitment to the people of Jesus Christ. And I would encourage you to make a commitment to the people of Jesus Christ who are connected with this place right here, who are connected with this church, Northwest Baptist. If that's a commitment you're ready to make today, put a little check mark in that box too. If it's a commitment you can't yet make, then I would say, well, what you could do is you could modify that line and make it custom for you. If you want to make a commitment to the people of Jesus, but you're not ready to make a commitment to this church, you could cross out Northwest Baptist Church. We're not sacred. Cross that out, but put a check mark down there to say, I'm committing myself to this. Or maybe the third commitment. The third commitment is the thing that says, I commit myself to the purpose of Jesus Christ. God's purpose in your life is not to leave it half done, but to take you to the next step, and the next step, and the next step. His purpose is to do that in your life and for others. And if you're ready to make a commitment to growth, to a step-by-step pursuit of His purpose in your life, put a check mark on that. And then the last one is a commitment to His plan. And do you realize that God's plan in this world is to use you and me? His plan in this world is to use this church, but His plan ultimately is to use individuals, you and me. And that's basically a commitment that says, you know what? I am not going to focus on who am I anymore. I'm going to focus on why am I here. You see, we're at a turning point today, and I am encouraging you. I want to challenge you to make all 4 of those commitments. Go ahead and check them off. If you can at least make the top commitment, then I want to invite you in the next section of our service to come forward and share in communion. We're going to do communion in a very special way today. What we're going to do is we've got these elements of communion up here. And I want you to come forward and bring your little recommitment form, fold it in half, and just drop it right here in the middle, in this little basket here. This is a statement between you and God. I'm going to look at these things, and if you want to become a member of this church, I'm going to use this little form as a way to follow up with you on that kind of stuff. But ultimately, this is between you and God. And so I want to ask you to come forward and to put your recommitment form right here in this basket, and then take a piece of bread and realize that this bread symbolizes the fact that Jesus died for you. Symbolizes that He came to this earth and lived on your behalf. And then died for you. And then come and take a cup, and you can eat it right up here. Put the cup back here when you're done with it. And just realize that this cup symbolizes the blood of Christ that was shed for you, so that you could have a relationship with God the Father in heaven. I want to ask you to do this on your own time. And not to follow the other people in your row. And not to follow some predetermined pattern. In fact, we're going to be singing 2 songs. And I specifically want to ask that no one comes up during the first verse of this first song. Because I want to just ask you to sit and reflect. To say, am I ready to make this commitment? Am I ready to make this kind of statement? The music team is going to come forward first. before the first verse is sung. But the rest of you, I just want to ask you to sit and reflect and pay attention to what God is speaking to your heart today. Let me pray for these things before we do it. Our Heavenly Father, we just ask that you would help us to make the commitments we need to make today. That you would reassure us that this turning point is a good place, and that you would help us to make it in a way that honors you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.